Hiya guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about preparation. What things do we need to check and do between race meetings to make sure that your car is as good as it can be on race day? So this is part one of a two-part series. This is kind of the things that you're sort of doing at home, checking over to make sure that your car is as good as it can be when you arrive to the track. Then we're going to have a part two that's sort of when you get to the track, things you can do, sort of setting up the speedo, looking at the track, things like that, more setup related, that can give you the extra boost to be rapid when you first get on the track. But we'll get back to this video for now, so we'll get straight into it. The first part of the car we're going to talk about is the diff, and we'll start off by talking about gear diffs. So, gear diff, usually you want to be replacing the oil pretty often, especially if you're racing on carpet. You've got a lot of force and load going through it, and usually you're going to be on a higher diff oil than you would be outdoors. So it really starts to turn black, degrade, sometimes leak, and yeah, it's just one of those things that you want to definitely keep consistent from week to week, because it's one of those things where you're going to eventually think, my car doesn't feel as good as it used to, and it's because the diff is, not in the same nick that it once was and is changing. So yeah, replacing the oil every meeting we do on carpet. Outdoors you might get away with every 2 meetings, something like that, but still, if you want to be sure, it is just one of those things that is definitely worth checking. Now, the other thing is, obviously that's the oil. You've got the sort of the O-rings and the gaskets in the diff as well. To us, we don't change them that often at all. We kind of do them maybe once a winter, once a summer, something like that, if we're using it outdoors. Maybe we should do it more often, I'm not sure. But we've never found it to make a massive difference or be sort of too important. So yeah, that's something that's not as important with the gear diff. So usually I think you can get maybe a little bit longer out of 4-wheel drive diffs than 2-wheel drive, just because usually they can fit a bit more oil in and actually possibly have less load going through them, since you've got both axles sort of sharing the drive. But still, every 2 meetings at least, you're probably going to want to take them apart and have a good look inside there to see what's going on. Moving on to the ball diff. Now, the ball diff's one of those things that how well it lasts very, very much depends on kind of a lot of circumstances. How it's built, what it's being raced on, how much power's going through it. So yeah, it's one of those things that you have to play a lot more by ear and sort of get a feel for when you need to replace it and things like that. So usually if you're racing on a very, very high grip, you're probably going to want to at least do something with your ball diff, probably every meeting or other meeting. So whether that's just taking it apart, re-greasing it, maybe changing the balls and the plates. Because what happens is it starts to get grainy and feel a bit grainy in your hand. And what that is when the diff starts to slip a little bit, sometimes the balls don't become perfectly spherical anymore and the plates get like too deep of a groove in them, and that's what can make it start to sort of feel a little bit grainy and notchy. So you might want to replace just the balls and the plates, something like that. Maybe just the balls to start with. You might get a bit longer out of the plates. You can obviously flip the plates over as well, so you've got the groove in the one side that you've just created. You can flip them over and get another new side out of the plates in the ball diff as well. So that's sort of higher grip. Lower grip, if it's sort of built well and you're not putting too much power through it, things like that, and it's not slipping, sometimes they can last for a really long time. So you might get 3, 4, 5 more meetings out of them and it still feels smooth and nice. And obviously sort of depending on the quality of the parts that you're using as well is going to make a difference. So it is one of those things you kind of have to get a bit of a feel for, but in conditions where you really want to be on a ball diff, it does make quite a lot of difference to have it feeling nice and smooth. So it is something that you want to make sure you're keeping up to date. The second part is the shocks. So again, we'll start with the oil. Now, it doesn't seem quite as critical as the diff. I don't think it's being worked quite as hard in the shocks as it is in the diff. And obviously it's a lot lighter and doesn't seem to leak quite as badly either. They seem to hold the oil very, very well, these shocks, to be fair. So we don't replace the oil every meeting. I mean, maybe we do if we're like changing oil, obviously going from track to track. But we don't specifically think every meeting we need to change shock oil. It seems to last a little bit longer in the 10th cars. In all conditions, really, we seem that to be okay. Unless it's maybe a really, really dirty track, you might realise you've got a bit of dust inside the oil. It kind of goes a bit muddy. You might need to change it then. But other than that, usually you're okay for a few meetings, really, on the shock oil. Now, the other thing that you've got with the shocks is you've kind of got the pressure that's inside them. So obviously we've done videos before of like how to bleed the shocks and things, so that's obviously bleeding the shocks. What that does is kind of get the right mixture of oil and air inside of the shock and get the right amount of both of those for that condition. But when the temperature changes and the pressure changes and things like that change, that can actually really affect how that mixture is working. So say you bleed your shocks in quite a cold condition and then you go to quite a warm track, what you might find is that your shocks pump up a little bit. If you pump your shocks and you push it in, it might start to rebound out a bit more than you'd want. You want it to have 0 and it's coming out on you and you're thinking, why is it doing that? That's probably because you've gone from colder to warmer conditions. So that is something to keep in mind. If you're changing sort of temperatures a lot, maybe from week to week, it might be worth re-bleeding your shocks. Just take the top off and just sort of refill them a little bit and just re-bleed the shocks to make sure that the rebound is as it wants to be. That's something to keep a note of. Another thing with the shocks is obviously the O-rings that people replace quite often. So again, on carpet, it doesn't seem as important. There's not as much dust and dirt getting up in there to sort of make them sticky to begin with. Obviously, they expand with the oil a little bit. But again, on carpet, you're running thicker oil things anyway, so it doesn't seem to be quite as sensitive. We change our O-rings maybe once every 2-3 months on carpet. I've not had any issues doing that. It's been okay for us. When you're running outdoors or on a more sort of dusty condition, maybe like on the dirt in the USA, if it's going a little bit dusty, you might need to bring that down a little bit to more maybe once every 1 or 2 months. You might sort of, again, when you're replacing oil, you can kind of just feel the shock shaft. Oh, that feels a little bit grabbier than maybe it should. Probably time to change the O-rings is something to watch out for. The other thing that you've got is you've got the shock caps and the sort of blue standoff part that the shock caps go on. Again, on carpet, they basically seem to last forever. Doesn't seem to be a problem. The blue part lasts almost as long as you need it to. And the shock cap, the only thing that can really go with the shock cap is if you're a little bit too heavy, you can round out that bleed screw. And what that'll do is obviously maybe allow air in and out and allow sort of the pressure inside the shock to change again, which you don't want. So obviously if you round out one of those, make sure you change the shock cap. But when you're running on a more dusty condition, what can happen is dirt can get in between the shock cap and the standoff, and it can start sort of grinding itself together and wearing away that blue part. And then you can get play in the shock cap and the blue part. So if that happens, make sure that you're sort of keeping an eye on that as well. Next thing on the checklist is bearings. So this is another one which is going to be very dependent on what conditions you're on. So carpet, tracks that aren't dusty, they're going to last quite a long time. You're going to get a while out of them. Whereas if you're sort of racing in the wet, on quite a dusty dirt track, dusty Astro track, something like that, they might last quite a lot less time. It could be even 1 meeting for some of them. So it's one of those where we don't really have an idea where we're like every X meetings we're going to replace the bearings. It's more a thing where you just get a feel for, yeah, that feels notchy, that should probably go in the bin kind of thing. So what bearings are the ones to look out for? Usually it's the hub bearings that probably go first, I would say. They're the ones that have got a good amount of force on them, and they're the ones nearest all the dirt and dust and grime as well. So they usually go first. Again, if you just sort of disconnect your hub so that you can spin your drive shaft, feel your sort of how much resistance is there in the bearings. If that feels really quite notchy and you think, that's definitely probably going to be affecting the smoothness of how it's driving, it might be worth replacing those bearings, feeling which ones feel like the issue, and at least replacing those ones. Same with the front as well, you can tell in that way. The other ones to look out for are ones on the diff. They seem to go quite early on as well. And then in four-wheel drive, the input shafts to the gearbox, the ones holding that, they tend to go quite early on as well. So yeah, it's just feeling for that notchiness. It's quite rare that a bearing actually fully seizes up, I think. But obviously when they go notchy, that's affecting how smooth they feel. And if you're racing stock, something like that, that's going to be super, super important, since you're trying to have as much power as you can and the smoothest drivetrain possible. So it really will be something to look out for then. Replace a bit more often. But yeah, it's just one of those things. You kind of got to have a bit of a feel around, see what it's feeling like, and replace them based off what you're thinking. One thing that can help with the life of the bearings is to just oil them. So there's plenty of brands selling RC bearing oil. Just put your bearings face down. We just seep a little bit through the metal side. You can see it go through, and that just helps keep the bearings lubricated and does make them last quite a lot longer. Next thing is drive shafts and outdrives. So starting with the drive shafts, this is going to be one you want to really keep an eye on when you're racing on dirty, dusty, sandy conditions. Anything that can get stuck inside your drive shafts is something you're going to want to remove pretty regularly. So if you got stuff inside your drive shafts, like inside the CVD, obviously that's going to bind it up. It's not going to work as it should. Should be able to articulate fully freely and have no odd binding or jamming in there. And sand or dust can make that quite a lot worse. So if it is dusty, we're racing on Astro Outdoors, we usually rebuild our CVDs every meeting. So we'll take them out, take them all apart, clean them all off with blue roll, and then we use sort of a black moly grease on the drive shafts, put them all back together with that. Don't get too much of it on, sort of just get it where it needs to be. Otherwise all the dirt and dust is going to stick to it even worse than it would do before. So yeah, that's what we use. So that's something that you really do want to keep on top of when it is dusty. The other thing that can go on with the drive shafts is obviously all the pins and things can wear out in the drive shafts. We do also quite often change the barrel and the pin that is inside the drive shafts. You can get a barrel and pin set from Associated that's just those two things, and that's something that we do probably change. Not so much on carpet, but again outdoors, the dusty conditions where it's all getting ground down, you'll see that the pin starts to turn into a sort of barreled shape at the end. Not what you want to happen. You want it to be nice and straight. So maybe every 3-4 meetings we'd replace the pin and barrel in dustier conditions as well. Make sure that that's up to date. And then the other thing that happens is obviously the dog bone itself can wear out at the diff end. So the pin through the dog bone can wear out, and also the diff outdrive goes from straight to having a bit of a U shape in it, where obviously the drive shaft is dug into it. Now that's something that actually as well has quite a big effect on how your car's driving, and that wears out in almost all conditions. On carpet it wears out a lot as well because of how much force is going through it. So usually they seem to kind of wear out together, but if you do notice that your drive shaft has a very good flat spot on the end and your diff's got like a pretty large U in it, at that point you are probably going to want to change to a new dog bone and outdrives in your diff. What that does, obviously when you've got a flatter spot on your drive shaft, that's going to create a lot more friction against your outdrive. And when you've got a bit of a U in your diff as well, that drive shaft is always going to want to pull to the middle of that U. And what that basically does is just stiffens up the rear end of the car a lot. So it can make your car feel like it's kind of diffing out a lot because you're trying to get on power. The back goes stiff and the inside wheel can just want to spin. I've had that before, and that's been the cause of it. It can also make your car just sort of want to drive in a straighter line because it goes stiff and just wants to drive off. So sometimes that can actually be the cause if they're very worn out, the drive shaft and the outdrive. So that's something that, again, on carpet, maybe every 6 or 7 meetings, maybe we're changing, something like that, maybe a little bit more. But yeah, again, that is definitely something to keep an eye on. Another thing that we've found can be really good is getting your tyres done and on before you get to the meeting. Now, obviously this only works, 1, if you have time to do that before you go racing, and 2, if you know what tyres and that you're going to be using, what foams you want to have in, things like that. But the idea behind that is it just gives you more time on the day to either have fun, go and have a look at the track, change your car, things like that. It just makes the day of racing quite a lot easier and better and less stressful for you. So that's the idea behind that one. Obviously, usually if you're gluing the sidewalls, trimming pins off, things like that, we wouldn't do that until we got there on the day, looked at the track and sort of decided how much sidewall glue and trim pins off we need, things like that. But yeah, that can be something that's really helpful to do as well. The next thing is the setup of the car. So you want to try and start out with the best setup that you possibly can. And that's obviously easier said than done. So if you're racing at the same track sort of week in, week out, I think it's a good idea to, between each race meeting, try and have a think about what your car was doing, why you couldn't go faster, what was stopping you from your car from going quicker, and try and sort of, learn, look at setups, and think about what you might want to change for the next week. And even if it turns out to be worse and you make a bad decision, you're going to learn something. If it's worse, then maybe go the opposite direction for the next week, something like that, and then your car will be better. And 3 months down the line, you're going to have tried loads of things, learnt loads of things, and you're definitely going to have a better car than where you originally started with. So it's one of those things, I think you've always got to try and push forward if you can, see what you think you can change. Even if your car feels good, I think it's usually worth trying things just to see what they do and see if you can find any gains from changing your car. And if you've not been to the track before, you're going somewhere new, things like that, it can be easy to think, oh, I'll try and leave my car as it was at this different place. It'll probably work at this new place as well. But at least, I think, put some research in, see if you can find any setups from the place that you go into, watch some videos of the track, look at some pictures. If it's much bigger, much smaller, think things like, oh, maybe I need a faster motor for this track. The track, the straight looks a lot longer. There's a lot more straight sections. Just things like that you're going to pick up on and think of ideas that you might want to change there. Also, if you know people who go to that place, speak to them, see what they think compared to the other club that you're running at, if they run at both as well. It is important to start at the best point that you can with the setup, because you don't want to be chasing it through the day necessarily too much. Otherwise, that can sort of throw you off. You're changing your car every run. You're not going to know what you're going out and driving. You're not going to sort of get used to your car through the day and have a feel for it. So yeah, you've got to try and start off in the best place that you can. So that's it. That's the bottom of the checklist. All of those things I think are definitely worth thinking about between events to make sure that your car's not sort of degrading over time, and also areas that you can improve in as well from week to week, things like that. So yeah, as always, check out our website. We've got pro builds on there, parts on there, things like that. So it's an interesting place to go and check out. Stay tuned for part 2 of the video, where we talk about things that you might want to do sort of when you get to the track, maybe, or maybe even if you get there before. But things like setting the camber, the toe, getting the speedo settings dialed in, choosing how much glue to put on your sidewalls, things like that will be in part 2. So yeah, look forward to seeing you there, and we'll see you in the next video.